So today we're going to be talking about sashing, and we're going to be using our pumpkin quilt to demonstrate how to put sashing on a quilt. So for sashing, I'm cutting my sashing a little bit bigger than the pattern to accommodate the request for a bigger quilt from my customer. So I cut my sashing to be 2.5 inches wide. So when we do sashing, we're going to sew first the smaller pieces to the right sides of the pumpkin. So you're going to cut your strips the size of the block. So the block is 11.5 inches long. So you would cut your strips 11.5 inches and then sew them all on the insides of the pumpkin. So you only need to sew to the right of each pumpkin. So it would be, you need 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces of sashing for each pumpkin. You would sew to the right, and then you would sew the row together. And then with a quilt, so if you were doing a table runner, you would add an extra piece of sashing on the outside of the pumpkins. But if you were doing a quilt, you're going to wait to put the sashing on the outside and just do one long strip of sashing. So we're going to combine that just like we do binding, where you take your ends, get 2 really long pieces here, cut the width of the fabric. So you take your sashing and you can combine right sides together. Now if you see, I do have a salvage piece here. So what I like to do, instead of trimming it, which this might be a little bit of a way to cheat, I just fold it next to it. So I always leave about 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch, depending on the size of the sashing, on the outside, and I just go and I sew from corner to corner, and that's going to give us our one continuous strip of sashing. So I'm going to sew 1/4 in a corner, and when you unfold it, it'll be one long strip. So these long strips are going to go in between each row, so on the top and the bottom of the rows, and on the very outsides of the rows. And then you add your border. So I will suggest that when you're making a, oh, I don't have to unpin that because I'm going to go sew that. But when you are making a quilt, not a table runner or a wall hanging, trying to get this back in a little bit of order, that when you sew these long pieces to your quilt, you start sewing them from the middle of the row out. And that's going to keep your fabric in your row from tweaking, because the more you push the fabric in one direction, the more the fabric will be, pushed that direction. Despite our best machines, we still have just a little bit of extra push when we sew. So that's going to cause your quilt to, instead of being straight, like you trimmed it and sewed it when it was small, it's going to start tweaking like this. It'll cause puckers, and it'll cause your quilt to be a little bit wonky. So the best way I found to keep my rows straight and square is to start sewing my sashing on from the middle of the row out, and then the middle of the row out. Same thing with the border. You start with the middle and work your way to the end. I start with the middle and work your way to the end. Okay, so here we have our piece sewed together. Now I did drop this while I was changing thread, so if you saw me unpin it, I did choose the other end. So we have the 2 salvage ends together. So you'll see I just lined it up on the outside of the salvage, and it comes out straight. So we just trim that and press it open. Again, with hidden seams, I tend to use scissors. Just a preference. Then we press it open. Okay, so we have our strips for our sides of our pumpkins, and then we have our long strip that's going to go in between the rows. Flip that over. So if you want to, you can trim the corners. They don't bother me, so I leave them there. So the best way I was talking about earlier to sew our row together was to fold this strip in half. So I make the corners meet. Bring it down. That's going to be our half. I'm going to put a pin there. Yes, I actually use a pin. Woohoo! Be a little bit tricky getting it in there. It doesn't have to be exact, but I like it to be nice and close. Okay, here we go. Pin to marker spot. Now we're ready to put our sashing on. So when we square a row, what we're going to be taking off is that little bit that's hanging off from a pumpkin that was a little bit bigger than the other pumpkins, and we're going to be trimming what fabric was pushed while we were sewing. So you can see I started here and ended here, and there's just a little bit left over on the top of these. So I believe these were the two that were a little bit bigger. Yep, and these hit exactly. And as I sewed, you can see, maybe, see if I can get darker fabric. Turn that upside down, there we go. You can see it just pushed a little bit up as I sewed. So we're gonna square our rows. It's gonna help us sew the sashing on much straighter. So these are the two that were a little bit bigger. So we're gonna line up the ruler with the lowest edge. So if your edges are a little bit off all the way down, you wanna make sure you find your lowest edge on the entire row. So a good way to do that is to fold it in half even, or to fold it in half. And I try to line up the seams here and here on my pumpkin. This one especially would be very helpful. This one at the top should be very helpful. So I line up my seam there, and the rest lines up really well. I bring it down and I check. Yep, it's a little bit bigger. That one lines up. It's a little bit bigger up here. And here, yep. Okay, so this little part right here looks like the lowest point, which is great because that's really close to the end of our row. So I'm going to go ahead and use that. So I'm lengthening it back out. Here's the point. That was the lowest on the entire row. So I'm going to stretch this out so it's on my ruler, or my mat. I'm going to use my ruler. I'm going to scoot this down, and I'm going to use a seam line to help me square this block. So I picked a random line on my ruler. It's 12 this time, so I'm lining up 12 on this seam, and I just scoot my ruler down until it hits the lowest point in the row. Just like that. Now I'm going to also use that and this line here, the 14, it looks like, to just make sure the 14 is straight. You can even move down here and see if that one's straight. This one's on 1/8 of an inch, and that lines up on those two sides, and it even lines up on the end of my row. Awesome. Okay. So you can see how much is there. So that's what we're going to trim. My hand flat and trim. Now if you're new still to cutting, keep that thumb tucked in. See, it's not too much. That one had a little bit more than this side, but see, usually it's only going to be about that much. But that much over 5 rows is going to equal about like 1/2 inch. So we want to make sure we trim as we go to make sure that we don't have a huge disparity as we sew our quilt together. So then we scoot this down. Remember, this part was our lowest point. So I don't scoot it down all the way, but I do want to get it off a seam because it was sticking. Okay. So I leave about 6 inches from what I've already cut to line up my ruler on. And then I line it all the way down using the lines in my ruler on the different seam lines to make sure that my ruler is straight. So that's straight down that way, straight down this way. This one was a little bit bigger too. Okay, I'm happy with that. Oops, moved just a little bit. Got a little bit of that one. That's okay. See, it's just a little bit that we're cutting off and trimming. That was just threads. Let's go down. Line it up. Checking the lines here. I'm using 10. Now I'm using 12. I'm looking at 15. And looking at where I already cut. Okay. Here's my ruler. It looks a little bit off. Let me look at that again. This corner goes in just a tad. There we go. Just the tiniest bit. Now there are ways to sew these together where you don't need to trim, but I don't suggest trying it unless you've had a lot of experience with how to make your rows straight. And we flip it over and we do the other side. Now I mostly sewed from the bottom of the pumpkin to the top of the pumpkin, so these might be just a little bit wobbly. I don't think there's a lot of extra up here, especially on this side of this row. Just a little bit. And here's where we have the extra hanging off a little bit. So I'm going to go to the lowest point and where I've already cut. Because I previewed it, I know that the lowest point will be accurate. So remember when we folded it in half, that was the preview I was talking about. So there we go. Just trim off that little bit. And when you're trimming and threads stick, you want to snip them. Don't try to use the rotary cutter again. You might cut off a little bit more than you want to. So the only downside to having a pumpkin that's just a slightly bit bigger is that you will most likely get a less pointy stem. But I'm okay with that. And the more accurate you are with your piecing and your 1/4 inch seam, the less you will need to trim. And the less non-pointy ends that you'll have. So there we go, just a little bit. Now it's time to sew our long piece of sashing on. So we've already got it marked in the middle. Now this is the top row, so if you want to just directly put your border onto the top row, you can do that. I like to put sashing in it to make the pumpkins stand out more. So I'm going to sew my sashing that sets together from the middle. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 3 is going to be my middle pumpkin. That's one way you can figure it out, especially because this is a 4 patch. That's going to be the middle. That's pretty easy to figure out. If there is no easy way to figure it out, you also fold your row in half just like we did with your sashing piece to find the middle. And I just pin in the middle. And I'm going to sew my sashing on from the middle all the way to the end. See, I have some left over. And I'm going to sew this middle all the way to the end. And that's going to keep it from getting too wonky. So let's go sew.